So the next question that we were sent, hold on, I'm pulling up my notes, was whether or not white people could practice animism. Now I'm going to get into the history of this in a second, but first I'm going to give the most basic answer, which is basically every culture in the world did at first. Your ancestors, if you go back far enough, likely practiced a version of animism. However, hold on, it is definitely the most common now in indigenous and First Nations religions and spiritualities.
What specifically is animism?
So animism comes from the Latin anima, breath, spirit, life, soul. And it's the belief that objects, places, creatures, basically absolutely everything has a spiritual essence. It is one of the defining characteristics in many occult, spiritual, witchcraft, magical paths. The idea that like water can have a spirit, this rock can have a spirit. Potentially, animism proceeds that all things, animals, plants, rocks, rivers, weather systems, things that you've built, and even words are animated and alive. Like words being animated and alive is very like that. That's found in Norse paganism. That is found in Hebrew spiritual beliefs, Hebrew mysticism. Every culture has its own version of this. Every culture, other than atheist, even Christians have versions of this. Like there are Christian paths where anything that you write the name of God on, you can't destroy because it contains a bit of God's spirit.
There's also versions where there's an angel of absolutely everything that acts as its spirit. So animism is a type of belief more than it is an individuated practice.
Right. However, there are religions that are primarily
animistic. And for example, many First Nations and indigenous traditions are fundamentally animistic. I think that's probably a fair statement. It's kind of an oversimplification.
Well, basically due to ethno-linguistic and cultural discrepancies, there's a big opinion difference in cultural anthropologists right now on whether animism refers to basically the ancestral mode of experience that was universal practically to people all around the world, or whether it is considered a full-fledged religion in its own right. And there's actually been debates going since like the 1870s as to whether animism is a religion or whether it is an aspect of religion's spiritual paths and magical paths.
It kind of depends on your criteria for a religion.
And the thing is, I think that it's both. I think there are people for whom animism is their religion, and there are people for whom animism is a part of their religion or their spiritual path or their magical path.
I just want you to know that I have colors in the wind in my head now.
That song's so fucked up. I mean, like, I love the part where she's like, you think the only people who are people are the people who look and think like you. Like, I love elements of the song, but it's definitely exotifying, and I mean, it's exotifying the rape and kidnapping and eventual death of an 11-year-old First Nations person as a way of stealing her land from her.
Yes.
So, anyway, I have issues with Disney and the movie Pocahontas, and issues with myself for how much I really love a super fucking problematic song.
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
That's
Basically, animism encompasses the belief that all material phenomena have a spirit and potentially agency, like they can make decisions. That varies. There's sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, so the idea that you can, for example, propitiate a storm by making appropriate offerings to it and bargaining with the spirit of the storm directly.
Exactly. The degree of sentience ascribed to different things varies very widely. And how many things have a spirit very widely. Like in some versions of animism, shadows have a spirit, and in some they don't. In some,
Yes, Hunchback of Notre Dame also has. Look, basically every Disney movie ever
has
is
some problematic elements.
to a greater or lesser extent. But yeah, Hunchback is another one.
Specifically, something to know is that you cannot be an animist at the same time as believing in Cartesian dualism. Basically, the idea that bodies cannot think, mental, that there's the mental and there's the body, but that bodies cannot think, and that only humans have souls.
Yeah, in particular, that last part.
So
you can kind of get away with it with partial Cartesian dualism,
but like strict Cartesian dualism.
No.
Anyway, there has been since the 1870s a lot of debate as to who gets to apply the term animism to who, and over time it actually so there's a debate on whether fetishism is animism, and if all animism is fetishism. There's a debate as to the evolutionary framework of religion and where exactly you stop being considered animist and start becoming a different kind of religion.
Typically polytheistic, but not always.
Well, basically there are forms of polytheism where it's like, this is the god of the ocean, this is the god of these trees, this is the god of this mountain. Is that a form of animism? Is that
animistic, and at what point is that not?
Right,
Yeah.
and then you get things like Hellenic polytheism, where the trees have a spirit, and that seems to be a form of animism. And then you have the Olympian gods, which seem to be somewhat different, and then you have the Titans, which are very much animistic.
On a grand scale.
Right, the idea that all the magma of the earth has a spirit is animistic. And intriguingly, if you look at Hellenic polytheism and you consider the potentiality that the defeating of the Titans was actually the phasing out of an animistic religion and into a polytheistic religion.
It takes on some interesting
Right,
complications.
and you see the same thing happening with like the war with the Firbolg and the Tuatha De Danann. There is now also what is called the new animism. Anthropologists and cultural anthropologists stopped using animism because they found that some of the anthropological theories were really too limiting. And that we were describing basically everything by this one umbrella term that really didn't accurately describe each culture, and that it was basically being used sloppily. So they kind of stopped using it. And right around the same time, a lot of indigenous communities were like, oh, wait, hold on, there's this word we can apply to our practices that will enable us to somehow legitimize them. We can be like, hey, no, here's what we are, we're animists. Instead of trying to use more nebulous and hard to convey ideology, that then ended up turning into cultural appropriation, where pagans and neo-pagans and New Age people looked at indigenous practices and they mimicked their animism. And doing that is definitely not okay.
Appropriative, yeah.
But returning to sort of a root concept of animism, or engaging in an animism from a non-closed culture, like the alchemists have a form of animism, that's not a closed culture.
Well, I mean, if you can decipher their freaking notes. It's not closed.
It's not closed. It's are you?
It's encoded, but
can
it's
you
not
solve
closed.
it?
Yeah.
Well, it becomes open to you if you can solve it.
Yeah.
That's how that.
I also have sort of a non-historical, not entirely spiritual point to make here.
Okay.
Which is that, I don't know about y'all, I know that I have certainly pointed at something on the shelf and told it to stay.
Or
where I am
said that your computer has a personality and has to be appeased.
Yeah. I know that just in casual daily life, I ascribe sentience and agency to inanimate objects. Often. This is not done necessarily as a religious or spiritual act, but it very easily could. And I know cases where it has. Let's use the computer as an example. We know someone who takes certain ritualized steps when they first turn on their computer to make sure it stays happy with them that day. So this is a form of ritual appeasement of the spirit of their computer. And that falls under the broad definition of animism.
Yes, it does.
And that's not appropriative, that's not even really problematic. And you can absolutely construct yourself spiritual practices and or rituals based on this kind of concept.
It would be very hard for me as a cunning or clever worker to do any kind of magical work without believing that, like, water is influenced by the spirit that the water is collected under. Okay. I think we basically...
Yeah, the TLDR, yes you can, don't steal someone else's.